Hey geeks, it is Scarlett with Mythical Entertainment. I have Logan Uber here for an interview for his latest book, Once Upon a Time. If you guys have not seen it, you need to check it out. We're going to drop some links for you so you're able to check out his project. Logan, thank you so much for taking the time to interview with us today.
Thank you for asking me to do an interview.
Okay, perfect. So tell us about yourself and your team. Who consists of Brothers Uber?
The Brothers Uber is a publishing company focusing on children's books. I am the owner and basically the go-to guy running everything, deal everything with product development, editing, distribution, promotions. And I work with a team of illustrators and authors from all around the United States.
Fantastic. And then who specifically worked on your Once Upon a Time project?
Once Upon a Time was a basically joint collaboration effort between myself, did a lot of the research for the different characters, and then the actual writing of the book, and Meredith Moriarty, who did the illustrations and the page layout and editing of the book, all of the visual sides.
And does Brothers Uber have any previous publications that you would like our geeks to know about?
Got a number of publications, a lot of children's books. We've got The Dragon and the Princess. It's a counting book by Eric Peterson with illustrations by Mina Sandwell, but it actually has a story where the elements are then counted. It's a fun story, dragons, princess, fantasy, and Mina actually hid a bunch of Easter eggs throughout the book just to add a little depth to it. There may be an appearance by Kermit the Frog or King Friday from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, as well as the One Ring from The Lord of the Rings, as well as a number of other little Easter eggs throughout it. Also got the book S is for Ska. It's an alphabet book by Jeff Munn, and it is just different genres of music illustrated in Jeff's fun, just kind of quirky illustration style. It just always makes people laugh.
Fantastic. And geeks will also drop some links into that as well. Logan, for the time being, though, tell us about Once Upon a Time. What made you want to create this kind of book?
Once Upon a Time is an alphabet book featuring fairy tale characters from around the world, beautifully illustrated by Meredith with a one-page kind of summary of who each character is and their story. And ever since I did my undergraduate studies, always fascinated with fairy tales, the cultural insights they give, just the exchanges of ideas, how they were able to transcend cultures, and how so many versions of the same character and the same story exist, each adapted to the cultural norms of each group. So just wanted to be able to share those little insights and to introduce readers to new characters from around the world.
And just to confirm, you were the author on it, and Meredith was your illustrator for the project, right?
Correct.
So just the 1-2 on this project?
Well, there was a number of people who helped out with editing and for the main work itself, yeah, it was the two of us.
Great. Are you just keeping Once Upon a Time strictly to a reading book for a children's publication, or were you kind of thinking maybe branching out with it? Because it's so large for an alphabet. Were you thinking, like, I know you guys have a coloring book for it. Were you thinking maybe like small comic strips for each myth or something different?
Just kind of see where things go. Do eventually, I want to create sort of a fairy tale encyclopedia where discussing more, where it'd be more for like older readers, discussing each character more in depth, just those cultural archetypes and how it transcended cultures and areas of the world, and having like a discussion of the actual story itself. What makes a story a Cinderella story versus a like Red Riding Hood story, and then also incorporating art and illustrations from a multitude of artists and illustrators from around the world.
Great. And then, originally my question was who was the targeted audience for Once Upon a Time? I know you said you guys were originally a children's publication, but obviously from your last answer, though, it looks like you're looking to branch out into a little more than just children's publication.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Once Upon a Time basically had it's got three main target segments. One is parents with young children. because the stories are one page each, makes it really nice for bedtime stories where you can read one story each night. They're short enough, you're not up all night, and at the same time, children are able to stay engaged with each story because of Meredith's beautiful illustrations. And then the second segment is older children able to read on their own. It gives them an opportunity to read and to discover those characters for themselves a little more personally as they explore the characters from around the world. And then the third and final segment is really for adults who are focused on like the fantasy genre and just really entertained by fairy tales. I know a number of individuals I've met who love fairy tales and they've studied fairy tales and they've got all sorts of fairy tale books and they look through the book and they're always surprised and interested because there's some characters in there they don't recognize. And so they're always happy to be able to learn more and to read and explore and discover.
Absolutely. And would you say, like, when you did Once Upon a Time, it was important to show a lot of diversity when it came to myths and legends? Like, you didn't want to primarily just focus on one region that was saturated with myths and fables, but instead to show everything that myths and legends encompass globally.
Yeah, definitely wanted to focus on more than one culture, more than one country. I know a significant chunk of the fairy tale lore comes from France and Germany. Everybody knows like the Brothers Grimm and the French fairy tales like Beauty and the Beast. And there's different versions and just wanted to really branch out. So incorporating characters from Egypt, Africa, China, Denmark, Norway, Russia is just really making sure to incorporate more than just the French and German versions.
Or what's just pretty much for the most part, I wouldn't say like popular in media, but well known at this point.
Right, they're the most well known just because of how stories are passed down, and I mean, it comes from a very succinct segment of European culture on fairy tales. And so these other versions and other stories from different cultures aren't traditionally passed down. Disney didn't do a movie of like Yijan from China. They actually did one of Cinderella from Europe, which Yijan is actually the original Cinderella character. It's the first Cinderella story, and it changes over time and eventually becomes Cinderella when it's brought into Europe. And so Disney did the European version of Yijan's tales. So just really focusing on that broader world view of how these stories existed even before some of them that we thought.
Perfect. And then when you were working on Once Upon a Time and you were trying to find, a fable or a myth to match to your letters, was it hard to pick certain myths over other ones?
For certain letters, it was a little more difficult. I mean, the big thing is, I mean, A is a very popular letter. So it was difficult for those letters that had a plethora of characters available. At the same time, there were some letters where there's very few choices. And so in that case, it was hard from a different reason, just trying to find something that really matched the magnitude of the work. So it involved a lot of reading, studying, research. I read well over 100 different tales and stories from all over the world.
Great. That sounds like a whole lot of studying when it comes to fairy tales on there at this point. But that's where like the encyclopedia idea comes from at this point, right? Like you just can't put every single like myth into A when you're only primarily just trying to focus on one for your ABC book.
Right. And so, yeah, as you're doing the research and studying and adding more and more, it's like, well, this is a really great character. Their story's amazing, but I've already got the perfect one for the book. And so, yeah, definitely. And the other things with an alphabet book, everyone expects kind of one of letter A, one of letter B. But with an encyclopedia, you can have like 20 entries for A and one entry for X, and everybody's like, oh, that's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's one entry that you found and you really wanted to use, but you had already found something for that certain letter that just didn't make it into the book?
Um,
You're like, there's a lot.
there's a lot. I mean, there's a whole list. Yeah, it really is. There's a whole list, and that's the biggest thing is there's so many out there and available, and it's like I want to do more, but there's one for G which I really wanted to do, but I wasn't able to because we picked Gretel and went with Gretel, which is amazing because went with Gretel and then also with Hansel for age, and so
You
you
tie
really
them
can't
in.
have one without the other. It's one of those basically unspoken rules.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, one character that I wanted to do for G was called Golden Riding Hood, um,
Oh,
which is very similar to the tale of Red Riding Hood, but it's later on in the fairy tale tradition. So the story actually begins with the basically the narrator talking about the fact that yeah, this story's been around for a while, but they messed up. The hood is actually gold, and then it has magical properties. And so there's a little twist to the tale where it acknowledges the earlier versions of Red Riding Hood, but then it's there to set the record straight that it's actually a golden hood.
so the most well-known variation's red, but guys, let's just keep it real. It was really gold. Kind of like Cinderella's glass slipper is the most iconic, but technically, depending on if you go further back, it's a fur slipper, if I'm correct, right?
Well, actually, I'm
You're like,
going
it's
further
further
back.
back.
Yeah, because I mean, the original Cinderella is the Chinese fairy tale. It's Yi Jian.
Right.
Instead of, I mean, a fairy godmother, it's a koi fish that takes care of her. There is a shoe in it. Depending on which version you're looking at, sometimes it's a jade shoe. Sometimes it is like a fur slipper. Sometimes it is a glass slipper. But I mean, that's what happens when you've got a story that's literally centuries old, and then it's even centuries older than that.
So, in your research, did you find that some of the myths that you had to exclude from your book were a little too mature in theme for a younger audience? I know sometimes fables and myths originally were really supposed to be used as warnings to people for certain things. Were just some myths where you were just like, just no, 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 not in this day and age for the wee ones.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I mean, definitely there were a number of them that were excluded because of the nature. And it's one of the things with Once Upon a Time is for each character, I also cite the story that we based the version on, as well as the author culture credited with recording it and the country it's from. Because, yeah, there's some versions which are very mature, and then there's also some versions which are very kind of all ages family friendly. So focusing on the family friendly versions. And so people are surprised because the Brothers Grimm get a very bad rep of being horrible and gory and just terrible tales. And yet there's a number of them that are actually more appropriate than like the French versions of the tales, and vice versa. There's a number of French versions which are more appropriate than the Grimm versions.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that does happen. Like you said, like with storytelling, people usually end up, it's cultural, right? So whatever is appropriate for them at that time or whatever message they're trying to convey is what they're going to tell.
Right, and what's appropriate for each culture definitely plays an impact. I mean, there are different times, a lot of them. I mean, there's some pretty crazy stuff going on at that time. I mean, it'd be common for somebody was a thief, you got your hand chopped off, or you were locked up in the stockades in the middle of town and people walked by and threw stuff at you. You were, I mean, it was a very different system. And so things like death were very common. And so that's why in like a lot of fairy tales, I mean, parents are dying just because mortality was so short at that point. that it was common for, a parent to die and for the other parent to remarry. And so that's why a lot of tales have like step parents in them because of just the commonplace nature of death at that time.
Do you find that when you were choosing myths and legends for your book that you kind of had to find which was the appropriate for your audience this day and age? Do you find sometimes that you have to like kind of just justify exactly why this fairy tale is being told the way it is, or just generally understand that like when they pick up this kind of book that there's going to be a ton of different cultures in here, so what may seem right to us is different for other people?
I mean, the big thing with the fairy tales themselves is each version can really be boiled down to a single archetype. So, like in the Cinderella story, there's always a stepmother, there's always sisters. You always have Cinderella, who's beautiful and amazing, but's forced to do like all of the terrible, dirty chores. But Cinderella always encounters a supernatural force, whether it's like the koi fish in the Chinese legends or a fairy godmother common in the European tradition. She gets transformed. There's a dignitary, there's a big party. Cinderella goes and it's beautiful. The prince or whoever's in charge of the party thinks she's the most amazing person ever and tries to go after her. She flees due to a time constraint and loses a shoe, and there's always that journey of trying on a shoe. So those archetypes for each story really don't encompass the negative aspects, the more mature themes. Those are the like adaptations for each culture, each story, or the storyteller, what they bring to it. So it came down to looking for the stories that portray the archetype succinctly and easily and beautifully through words, and then picking that version.
Absolutely, that makes so much sense. It makes it easier for people to, relate to it at that point, right?
Right, and I mean that's one thing with the book itself is included a number of versions from different cultures. So there's Jolita, which is an Egyptian fairy tale character whose story is, I mean, almost exactly the same as Donkey Skin, which is a French fairy tale character. And they both share similarities with Katie Woodencloak. It's a Norwegian fairy tale that also, Katie Woodencloak also shares aspects with Cinderella. So there's these archetypes, and so that's one thing with people being able to read through the book is while children might not pick up on the similarities and being able to appreciate that older audience that's reading through it will be able to sit back and be like, wow, there was a lot going on. You had Egypt and France exchanging ideas and having similar fairy tales.
And I think ultimately it's a really great way for us to remind each other that yes, we're from different cultures and thousand miles apart, but there's still a lot of the same interlocking themes that we as human beings share with each other when it comes to storytelling. So just to carry on, which is your favorite fable or myth that you put into the book and why?
That's a pretty unfair question.
You're like, all of them? That's why there's an entire book.
Right. I mean, after doing so much research and reading hundreds of tales and I mean, really falling in love with each of the characters, I mean, they all had their different aspects and just the variety. I mean, there's a few that I really like. I mean, one of my favorites in there is The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde, Jolita, and the Princess in the Suit of Leather, the Egyptian fairy tale I was talking about, as well as Princess Zeneb from Princess Zeneb and King Leopard, which is also an interesting one because it's a French fairy tale that actually takes place in Indonesia. So yeah, I mean, yeah, they're all my favorites, but yeah, those three really stand out.
Those were your standout ones. Like when you read them, you were like, yes, I absolutely need to include these.
Right, and Jolita is actually featured on the cover of the book.
Oh, is that? Oh, that's right. Yes. I do recall that one on there. I should have had the cover of the book pulled up so I'd be able to look at it. Speaking of cover of the book, though, I know you can't speak to it so much more than Meredith can, but do you happen to know which illustration she found to be the most difficult for her to portray?
Um, I mean, Meredith's an amazing illustrator. For most of the characters, what I actually did is I gave her, here's the character's name, here's the story, you get it portrayed how you want. And one thing that Meredith does an amazing job is being able to really convey who the character is through her illustrations. So there were a number of times where she'd email me the final image, and she'd be like, "Hey, here it is," for like Elena, the fair from the Frog Princess. She emailed that one, and then in the email she's like, "Yeah, I hate doing water. I don't know why I did water." So Elena is actually a little girl sitting on a lily pad, and it's all this water with ripples and textures and light, and it's like, oh. And then also Thumbelina, she emailed Thumbelina, and she's like, yeah, I might have gone a little overboard on Thumbelina, but yeah, I got carried away. It was a lot of work, a lot more than I originally thought when I started.
That's the good thing, though, about having like 25, 26 different entries is that, whatever doesn't work for one of her photos, she can always try and do in another illustration.
Right, and it was just the difficulty in the time-consuming aspect, especially for like the water, because we're so used to seeing water in our daily lives that if we see a picture of water and it doesn't look like it's normal, then we automatically think, oh, that picture doesn't look good. We might not know why, but our subconscious is going to be like, yeah, there's something off about it. So just being able to really encapsulate the ripples, the textures, the light, the reflection and refraction. And so it's just, yeah, a lot to do.
A lot to do. Well, if Meredith does catch this interview, or you can go ahead and relay it over onto her for me, is that what I love about her illustrations for this book is that there's plenty of detail for you to appreciate her work, but not enough where it's like you're distracted from her character portrayal. Her character portrayal is very straightforward and like this is your character and this is what you want to focus on. And that's what I really love about that is like when you're reading the story, it's not hard to imagine how Meredith wanted to portray the character. And now you have this really great photo that's very straightforward for her vision in your head. So when you read that story, you can see the character in it.
Right. And I mean, I went and I had the idea and I was looking at different portfolios and different illustrators. And that's, I mean, one of the reasons why I picked Meredith, her ability to have so much detail, but at the same time, not going overboard to really convey who the character is through her illustrations. And I mean, just love going through the book and the artwork because the characters, it's not the same character or the same like pose,
It's not the
just with
same
a
model.
different clothes. Yes. So she really did encapsulate who each character was and elements and aspects of each story. So as you read through that one page summary, you're like, oh, that's why she did that. It's immediately apparent, and then it's very easy to link. So when you see that image again, it's like, oh, I know exactly who that is.
Absolutely. And she does this really great thing too in her illustrations where like when you're reading it and you know you're reading a cultural story, she captures the cultural elements in her illustration very well where you're just like, "Oh yeah, absolutely. This is not the French version of what we were used to seeing in it."
Yeah, and she did like the little elements. I know, like for Vasilisa, which is a Russian character. Just kind of the texture and the for the dress and the detail on the dress is very more Russian in style. Yizhan beautifully portrayed as a Chinese character. The setting for Zeneb and the Indonesian clothing. So really being able to focus on each culture and that style of dress for that fairy tale is great.
Absolutely. She's a beautiful illustrator. Will you be working with her on further collaborations?
Uh, well, actually, have another book that is it's currently on Kickstarter, raising funds to help cover the cost of printing. It is a chapter book based on fairy tales. It's a fantasy book. It's a sort of an early reader chapter book, and at the beginning of each chapter, Meredith has actually done a black and white sketch, basically who that chapter's about, what character it's revolving around, as well as a full page illustration for the introduction to the book. So, yeah, we're actually working on that, and that book should be released by the third quarter of this year.
Fantastic. And what was that project called?
It's called Once Upon a Time, a Bit Earlier. The premise of the book is basically you've got the magic mirror from like Snow White isn't a very nice mirror, so he actually is got a group of villains, and they're using magic to manipulate time to try and stop like the fairy tale stories from playing out how we know them to. And so the whole book is the fairy tale characters younger than like the final ages and we typically know, and how they interplay together and trying to overcome the mirror and this plot to destroy all of the good in fairy tales.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. The information on that one as well. We'll drop the links for the Kickstarter and everything else in the interview.
Yep, we'll do that.
Perfect. Sorry, back on track with the with the Once Upon a Time interview on this one too. When your audience picks up this book and they're reading it, what are you hoping for them to walk away with once they get done with it?
The big hope is for them to realize that there's more fairy tale characters than just like Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty. There's more out there, and that fairy tales transcend cultures. And as they read through the book, to be able to realize that, yeah, these stories have existed for hundreds of years, and the same stories that different groups and cultures have passed down are similar to the stories that we tell and we pass down. And we're just kind of all part of this larger family of storytellers, and that those ideas and cultures that we hold dear in our stories are also can be found in other cultures' stories and what they tell.
One tribe, right? One tribe, all the same story. So, what do you find are some of the like predominant themes when you're, trying to pick out your fables and your stories in here? What are some of the predominant themes that you find are on them in those?
I mean, the biggest thing is, I mean, it's been around forever. It's that whole idea of good versus evil, but it's more than that. Is a lot of the characters that we love in fairy tales, they didn't become who they were almost destined to be until they'd persevered through hardship, through trials, and that it takes work to become basically who we're really meant to be. That as we persevere through tough times, it's helping to make us better.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Thank you so much for the interview. I know I personally met you at WonderCon this year. What other conventions can our viewers be able to meet you at?
I will be at TechoCon Pittsburgh next weekend. I'll be at MegaCon Wizard World in Philadelphia. I'll be at San Diego Comic-Con in the summer, as well as Denver Comic-Con. And also on my website, there's a list that continues to get updated for all of the conventions I'm going to be at this year.
Busy, busy, busy. It's that time of the season, right?
Right.
And just to confirm too, if they're not able to make it out to a convention to meet you and grab a book, they're able to order off of brothersuber.com, right?
Available on brothersuber.com. Yeah. And I mean, especially I travel a lot, and I'm always happy to stop into like libraries or schools and to meet with people. It comes down to coordinating schedules. So I mean, like this whole past month I was on the road. Went to Michigan, Tucson, then Las Vegas, and then Los Angeles. And being on the road, there's plenty of time to stop and meet people wherever. So I'm always happy to meet with people and just say hi and yeah, sharing some of that passion for yeah, great stories.
Absolutely on that one. It's always great when you get to share really good stories with everybody. Just one last question for any of our writers that are listening. What is the one piece of advice that you would like to give them if they're looking to start their own book?
I mean, the biggest thing is to write. The only difference between a best-selling novel and a really good idea is one actually got written. And I mean, that's the big thing is just taking the time to sit down and to write and to just keep on writing. An idea not acted upon is just a wishful dream. So, I mean, to sit down to write and to read a lot, to engage in other people's stories and to make your own.
That's so immensely true, guys. Logan, thank you so much for taking the time to interview with Mythical Entertainment. Geeks, just remember I'm going to drop a couple links here for you to be able to check out Logan's work for Once Upon a Time. You're able to go ahead and order his fantastic books from Brothers Ubers, not just One Upon a Time, at brothersuber.com. I'll also drop the link to his new Kickstarter that he was working with Meredith with as well on there. Logan, again, thank you so much for taking the time to interview with us. We very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
All right, geeks, we'll see you next time with Mythical Entertainment. Thanks.